Hello, everyone. It's Professor Kruger. Let's talk about modes of transmission. They're sometimes referred to as routes of transmission. I'm going to take you through these concepts and we'll take a look at the map that I would put together based on what's in your textbook. And then I'm going to talk a little bit more about why that is not the absolute authority on classifying these modes of transmission. So we're first going to start with what's in the textbook itself. And what I would recommend that you do before you try to draw out any type of visual map is just take a look at the concepts that are listed here and try to group what you know should be connected. You can also look for the concepts or the terms that are more general, or in other words, they would have different concepts connected to them. So the more general, the more likely you can connect other concepts to those general terms. So regardless of the way that you go, doesn't really matter. You're just trying to group similar concepts together and make sure that you can visually represent those connections in an accurate way. So by looking at this, there are some things that I notice. There are some types of contact which seem like they are very close contact. So when I'm looking at this, I'm looking at things like skin-to-skin contact, I'm looking at sexual contact, I'm looking at mucous membrane to mucous membrane contact. All of those things, also kissing, all of those things are pretty close forms of contact. And when you look at the rest of the terms, we have a term for this, which is called direct contact. So sometimes these are called close contacts, but for the majority of sources, you're going to see these referred to as direct contact. So you know that those kind of belong together. Looking at the other terms that we see here, we have, in contrast to direct contact, we have indirect contact. And if you look at your book, basically everything else that's listed here is listed as a form of indirect contact. So that includes things like food, fomites, vectors, aerosols, dried droplets, regular droplets, water, dust, biological products, and also air. So this is one of the major distinctions between the two different categories of modes of transmission. So direct contact versus indirect contact. And your book lays this out in a fairly specific way. If you haven't yet looked at the information in the chapter, then you should definitely do that. The information is in chapter 11, and the routes of transmission or the modes of transmission start on page 198. And they actually have most of the list on page 200. So I'm just going to show you outline what they're showing you here. This is actually page 199, and it may be hard for you to see. Let me zoom in on this a little bit. Okay, so down at the bottom of that page, again, this is page 199, you're going to see direct skin-to-skin contact. So this is direct contact, and this is one of the types of direct contact. Then if you look at page 200, you're going to see a listing of the other types or the other modes of transmission. So they're characterizing direct mucous membrane to mucous membrane contact by kissing or sexual intercourse. So when you're talking about kissing or sexual activity, sexual contact, you're usually talking about mucous membrane to mucous membrane in some form, whether it is oral, whether it's vaginal, or whether it is anal. So all of those things involve mucous membrane contact. Then what you're seeing is they go into indirect contact. So they have indirect contact via airborne droplets of secretions. They have indirect contact via food and water. contaminated with fecal material, indirect contact via arthropod vectors, indirect contact via fomites that become contaminated by all these different types of things that they can be contaminated with. And then you have indirect contact by transfusion of contaminated blood or blood products. This is what we would also refer to as biological products. And that's what the term that I've used on the actual concept sheet. So if we were to go ahead and start sketching this out, we can see what this might look like. So again, this is according to your textbook. So I'm going to put this list aside and then start to sketch out a visual on what this might look like. So we are looking at modes of transmission. And in your book, it puts these into two major categories. You have modes that are direct contact, and you have modes that are indirect contact. Under direct contact, they're making a distinction between what they're calling skin to skin and what they're calling mucous membrane to mucous membrane. Now, the other types of direct contact that we looked at on the sheet included things like kissing. That would fall under the mucous membrane to mucous membrane. And then also any type of sexual contact is usually going to fall under mucous membrane to mucous membrane. So whether that is vaginal sexual contact, whether it's oral sexual contact, whether it's anal sexual contact, all of that falls under mucous membrane to mucous membrane. I'm just going to zoom out so that you can see all of this. Okay, good. Okay, the other thing I'll just mention quickly is sometimes people have a hard time talking about things like sexual contact, but it is important that you're able to talk about all of these different types of sexual contact without putting any judgment, regardless of your personal feelings of whether you feel like it's proper or not. You have to be open to the possibility of what human beings do. And human beings, regardless of their sexual orientations, are going to engage in a variety of different sexual contacts. So you have to just be comfortable with that and not make it into a big deal. You have to remain neutral, okay? All right, so that's the direct contact. Now, in your book, it talks about all these different types of indirect contacts. So again, I'm going to kind of list out from what they're listing in your book here. So they're saying indirect contact by droplets. So what they're naming here, airborne droplets. That's what they're saying here. So airborne droplets. Then they're saying indirect contact via food and water. So contaminated food and water. Indirect contact via arthropod vectors. Vectors are typically insects, although not always, and they're typically arthropod insects. So we're talking about things like mosquitoes and ticks, things along those lines. Vectors are carriers of infectious agents, but they don't get sick themselves. So they don't actually have a disease state due to these infectious agents, but they can transmit them from one host to another. And the host, if the host becomes infected, then that infection can lead to a disease state. Not always necessarily, but it can happen. So arthropod vectors, and then they make a distinction with fomites, and then they have the biological products. If you don't already know, fomites are inanimate objects. things like door handles, surfaces of tables, faucet handles of sinks. So inanimate objects that people would be touching on a fairly regular basis in their daily lives. So this is the way that your book sets this up. And I'm going to go back to the list of what the terms are that I gave you. We've got some things that I haven't accounted for yet. So I'm just going to go back to this list. So we've done direct contact, food, fomite, vectors, mucous membrane to mucous membrane contact. Okay, we haven't done aerosols. We haven't done dried droplets. We have talked about droplets in general, skin-to-skin contact, sexual contact, water, indirect. Okay, dust, we haven't mentioned yet. Kissing, biological products, and air. So when you look under airborne droplets, your book doesn't really differentiate what's under here all that well, in my opinion, but I'm going to go ahead and outline this for you so you can have an idea of what is really going on here. So airborne droplets, you typically have two different types of droplets. So you have what are called or referred to as kind of regular type droplets. These tend to be rather large. And when these come out of a portal of exit, typically from coughing or sneezing, then they tend to fall to the ground within about 1 meter. So if you've had Biology 121 or something similar, hopefully you remember what a meter stick looks like. So these droplets, these large droplets, they fall to the ground typically within about 1 meter. But then you have droplets that are small, and these are referred to as dry droplets. The reason those are different is because when they are smaller, the droplets basically dry up, but they still have the infectious agent in them. When they are smaller, that means that they then can be carried by air currents, they can also be carried by dust. So when we talk about things that are airborne, your book is kind of lumping all of this together. And I have to tell you that the CDC does not. So the CDC makes a different distinction here, and I'll talk about that once I'm done doing this. So as with some other things we've talked about, your book is not the end-all and be-all of microbiology land. And so the CDC might use these terms differently, and you may not think that it makes much of a difference, but when we talk about COVID-19, it actually does make a very big difference. So I'm pointing it out now to kind of prepare you for that conversation, but just know that not all sources are going to organize these concepts in the same way. This is what your textbook is doing, okay? So let's see what else we have left here as far as the concepts go. Okay, so we did dried droplets, we did dust, we did air. So the only thing that's left are aerosols. This one is tricky, quite frankly. In your book, it actually, I don't know if it specifies aerosols. Can't remember, honestly. Let's look. So I'm just taking a look in the index to see if they're talking about aerosols specifically here. I included the term because this term has been in the news when it comes to COVID-19. And so I want you to know what this is referring to. It's not in the index. I'm checking the glossary. I'm not seeing it in the glossary either. Okay, so I'm going to leave that term off of here then, because the book is not actually mentioning it, not that I can see right now. Okay. An aerosol, though, in general, means that you have droplets that are in the air kind of in a concentrated manner. So I'm going to leave it at that for now, okay? Like I was saying before, this idea of the airborne and droplet transmission, this is going to look different when you look at the CDC descriptions. And I know that's frustrating, but this is the reality of looking at different sources. And this is exactly why you should look at different sources, because they don't always say the exact same thing. And that's just the reality of science. So, especially when it comes to public health and things having to do with human populations. So again, the direct contact, this is pretty much the same wherever you look. So skin to skin, direct contact, mucous membrane to mucous membrane, direct contact, kissing, sexual contact. No matter where you look, that's going to be direct contact. These other things like food and water, arthropod vectors, fomites, biological products, those are going to be characterized as methods or forms of indirect contact. What is in debate, or what differs from your book to the CDC, is this issue of the droplets. So this is where you'll see a departure from what your book has put forth. And again, I'll talk more about that when I talk about the COVID-19 mode of transmission, because that is where this really becomes an issue of language and how you are presenting modes of transmission. An important issue, an issue that can have serious consequences. And so we'll talk more about that in a separate video. If you have any questions, please let me know. Your map did not have to look exactly the same as this map. That's totally fine, but you want to be checking to make sure that your connections are accurate. So if your connections are showing the same connection relationships that you're seeing here, then that's great. But your map or your map may be looking different from mine. So they do not have to look the exact same way. And I can mention one other thing. The CDC actually characterizes food and water as fomites, I believe. Or maybe they use a different term. I'll have to go back and take a look. But fomites are inanimate objects. I have seen sources where they refer to food and water as inanimate objects, so they kind of lump those in with fomites, but I've seen other sources that do not. So the bottom line is, depending on the source you're looking in, they will define and kind of characterize these things a little bit differently. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to, again, talk about the CDC, what they do, in the separate video on COVID-19. And we'll talk more about how you handle this, because I know that as a student, this can be incredibly frustrating. So I'm going to end this one here. Let me know if you have any questions, and I will make the separate video on the COVID-19 chain of infection.